My name is Elliot, though for a long time I wasn't sure what name truly belonged to me. I'm 34 years old now, and I'm sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of tea that's gone cold twice already, trying to figure out how to tell you a story that took me most of my life to understand. I want to talk to you honestly today, not because I think my experience is extraordinary, but because I know how lonely it feels to carry a question inside yourself that you don't have words for. I spent decades believing I was the only person in the world who felt the way I felt, and if this story reaches even one person who is quietly wondering who they are underneath the version of themselves they've been performing, then the discomfort of speaking about it publicly will have been worth every uneasy sentence. I grew up in a small town in the middle of the country, the kind of place where everyone knew your father's name and expected you to become a smaller version of him. My father was a good man, a mechanic with hands that always smelled faintly of engine grease and coffee, and he loved me in the practical way that men of his generation often did, by fixing things for me and teaching me to fix things for myself. My mother was softer, a nurse who worked long shifts and came home tired but never too tired to press a hand against my forehead to check for fever, or to sit at the edge of my bed if she sensed I couldn't sleep. I say all this because I want you to understand that my childhood was not a wound. It was not a place I was running from. Whatever I would eventually come to feel about myself did not come from cruelty or neglect. It came from somewhere deeper, somewhere I didn't have a map to. The first memory I have of feeling that something inside me didn't line up with the outside of me was when I was maybe 5 or 6 years old. My older sister, Marianne, was playing dress-up in our grandmother's attic, and she asked me to put on a lace shawl and a pair of clip-on earrings that were far too heavy for my small ears. I remember laughing because it was silly because we were children, and everything was a kind of pretending. But I also remember catching my reflection in the dusty oval mirror leaning against the attic wall, and I remember feeling, for a moment, that the person looking back at me was more familiar than the person I saw every morning when I brushed my teeth. It was not a dramatic feeling. It was not a revelation. It was just a small, quiet sense of recognition, the way you feel when you meet someone at a party and realize halfway through the conversation that you already know them from somewhere else. I didn't have language for it. I was 6. I put the shawl back in the trunk and went downstairs for lunch, and I didn't think about it again for years, at least not consciously. But feelings like that don't really go away. They just wait. They sit in the corners of your mind and gather dust, and every now and then, when you're least expecting it, something will brush against them and stir them up. For me, that something happened again when I was around 11. It was a rainy Saturday and my parents were out running errands, and I was home alone with permission to make myself a sandwich and stay out of trouble. I remember standing in the hallway outside my sister's bedroom, and I remember the strange, magnetic pull of her open door. I didn't want to steal anything. I wasn't even sure what I wanted. I just walked in and stood there, looking at the way her room felt different from mine, softer somehow, more considered, more deliberately arranged. And then, almost without thinking, I picked up one of her sweaters from the back of her chair, and I held it up against my chest in front of her mirror. I want to be careful here because I know how these stories can be told in ways that flatten them into something they aren't. What I felt in that moment was not thrilling or shameful in the way that people sometimes assume. It was honestly a kind of stillness, a sense of, oh, there you are. And then, just as quickly, a rush of panic, because I was 11 and I had already absorbed enough of the world to understand that boys were not supposed to feel, oh, there you are when they held their sister's sweater to their chest. I put the sweater back exactly where I had found it, smoothed it, and walked out of the room. I remember washing my hands afterward, as if I had touched something dirty, though I couldn't have told you what I thought was dirty about it. The dirtiness was somewhere in me, I decided, and if I just didn't let it out, no one would ever have to know. That became my strategy for most of my adolescence. Don't let it out. Don't look too closely. Don't ask the question, because you might not survive the answer. I threw myself into being the kind of boy my town expected. I played baseball, badly, but with enthusiasm. I made friends with the loudest kids because I figured if I stood next to them, no one would notice how quiet I was underneath. I got a paper route and then a job at the hardware store, and then a girlfriend named Sarah in the 11th grade who was patient and kind and who deserved so much more honesty than I was capable of giving her at the time. I loved Sarah, in the way that a scared person can love someone who feels like shelter. But there was always a wall between us that I could not name, and I know now that the wall was not made of anything she did or didn't do. The wall was me, holding a version of myself away from her, because I was terrified of what she would see if I ever let her close enough to look. The feelings kept surfacing throughout those years, in small and unpredictable ways. I would catch a glimpse of a woman on the street, not with attraction, but with a kind of aching, wistful envy, and I would wonder why that particular emotion had chosen me. I would find myself lingering in the women's clothing section of department stores when my mother sent me to pick something up for her, running my fingers along the fabrics and then pulling my hand back as if I'd been caught doing something forbidden. I would dream, sometimes, of being someone else, someone lighter, someone whose body felt like a home instead of a costume. And every morning I would wake up and put on the same jeans and the same t-shirt and the same face, and I would go about my life as if the dreams had never happened. I want to talk for a moment about shame because I think shame is one of the least understood forces in a person's life. Shame is not the same as guilt. Guilt says, I did something wrong. Shame says, I am something wrong. And when you grow up believing that the deepest, quietest part of yourself is something wrong, you learn to spend enormous amounts of energy hiding that part, even from yourself. You become fluent in the language of self-erasure. You become an expert at translating your own feelings into acceptable equivalents before they reach your conscious mind. It's exhausting, though you don't realize how exhausting until much later, when you finally set the weight down and understand what you've been carrying. I went to college in a bigger city, about 4 hours from my hometown, and for the first time in my life I was surrounded by people who didn't already have a version of me in their heads. That kind of anonymity is a strange gift. It didn't make my questions go away, but it gave them a little room to breathe. I remember one night in my sophomore year, sitting alone in the dorm because my roommate had gone home for the weekend, and I decided, on an impulse I still don't fully understand, to walk to the drugstore 2 blocks away and buy a single tube of lipstick. I was 20 years old, and my hands were shaking at the checkout counter, like I was buying something illegal. The cashier didn't look at me twice. She scanned the tube, took my crumpled bills, handed me a receipt, and wished me a good night. I walked back to my dorm room, locked the door, sat on the edge of my bed, and looked at the lipstick for almost an hour before I could bring myself to open it. When I finally did put it on, badly, unevenly, way outside the lines of my mouth, I looked in the small mirror above my dresser, and I cried. Not because I was sad. Not because I was happy. I cried because for the first time in my adult life, I felt like I had met the person I was supposed to be looking at. And then I panicked. I wiped it off frantically with a handful of toilet paper, scrubbed my mouth raw with soap, threw the tube in the bottom of my trash can under a pile of other garbage, and told myself I would never, ever do that again. I told myself it was a phase, a curiosity, a weird night, and I was going to be normal from now on. I told myself a lot of things I would eventually stop believing. The next several years were what I would now describe as a slow, quiet emergency. On the outside, I was doing everything right. I graduated from college with a business degree. I got a job at a mid-sized marketing firm. I moved into an apartment with a nice view of a parking lot. I dated women, some seriously, some not, and I kept being told, kindly and sincerely, that I was a good person who was somehow just a little bit hard to reach. I heard that phrase from 3 different women in the span of 4 years. Hard to reach? And each time I nodded and apologized and told myself I would try harder to be present, to be open, to be whatever the person across from me needed. But you can't be open when you're standing guard over a door you refuse to open even for yourself. I understand that now. I didn't then. The nights were the hardest. I would come home from work, eat something out of a container, and then sit on my couch in a silence, so heavy it felt physical. Sometimes I would go for long walks around my neighborhood, hoping to tire myself into sleep. Sometimes I would drink more than I should have, not because I liked the taste, but because it briefly quieted the part of my brain that kept asking questions I didn't want to answer. And every few months, in a pattern I began to recognize with something like dread, the pressure inside me would build up until I couldn't stand it anymore, and I would find myself in a drugstore or an online shopping cart, buying something small, something private, something that let me spend one evening feeling like the person I was too afraid to admit I might be. And then, without fail, I would throw everything away the next morning, promise myself it was the last time, and start the cycle over. I'm telling you all this not because I'm proud of it, but because I want to be honest about what secrecy does to a person. It doesn't just hurt you. It doesn't just isolate you. It teaches you to distrust yourself because you know, on some level, that you are lying. And if you can lie to yourself this convincingly, you start to wonder what else about you is not what it seems. I lost my sense of who I was, not because I didn't know, but because I refused to look. And the longer I refused, the harder it became to remember that there had ever been anything to look at in the first place. The turning point, if I can even call it that, came when I was 28. My father had a heart attack. He survived, thankfully, but I remember standing in the hospital hallway, listening to the beeping of machines through a half-open door, and thinking, with a clarity I had never allowed myself before, that life is not as long as we pretend it is, and that if I died tomorrow, no one in this world, not my parents, not my sister, not any of the women I had dated, not a single friend, would have known who I actually was. I would have died a stranger to everyone, including myself. And that thought terrified me more than my father's heart attack. It terrified me more than anything I had ever been afraid of because I realized that I had been dying already, slowly for years, and no one knew because I hadn't even told me. I didn't do anything dramatic that day. I didn't come out to my family in the hospital cafeteria. I didn't throw open the closet doors and announce myself to the world. What I did was much smaller and, in retrospect, much more important. I went home, sat down at my kitchen table, and wrote a single sentence in a notebook I had bought years ago and never used. The sentence was, I don't know who I am, but I would like to find out before I run out of time. And then I closed the notebook, and I went to bed, and I slept better than I had slept in years. It took me another 6 months to do anything about that sentence. Change, real change, is rarely a lightning bolt. It's more like a thaw. Something inside you begins to soften, and you don't notice it at first, and then one day you realize the ice has receded a little, and the ground underneath is different than you remembered. During those 6 months, I started reading. Not books about identity, not at first. I was still too afraid for that. I read novels about people who had lived lives they didn't expect to live. I read memoirs by people who had reinvented themselves in middle age. I read poems, which I had never really cared for before because poems seemed to say the things I couldn't say to myself in prose. And slowly, without quite meaning to, I began circling the question I had been avoiding. Eventually, I found a therapist. Her name was Dr. Amara Wells, and she was a woman in her 60s with silver hair and glasses that were always slightly crooked on her nose. I didn't tell her about the clothes for the first 3 sessions. I told her I was lonely. I told her I felt disconnected from my own life. I told her I was tired in a way that sleep didn't fix. And she listened, without pushing, without interpreting, until one afternoon in her office, in the middle of a sentence about my job, I stopped talking and started crying, and when I could speak again, I told her that I thought I might not be the person I had been pretending to be for 30 years. She didn't blink. She didn't gasp. She just handed me a tissue and said, "Thank you for trusting me with that. Tell me more when you're ready." It's hard to describe what it felt like to be met, for the first time, without judgment. It was like being given permission to breathe after decades of holding my breath. Over the following months, in her office, I began to unspool the story I had never told anyone. The attic, the sweater, the lipstick, the nights of shame, and the mornings of resolve. Dr. Wells never told me what to make of any of it. She would only ask me questions, and the questions she asked were the ones I had been asking myself in silence for years, but hearing them spoken by another person changed something. It made them real. It made them mine instead of secret. It was Dr. Wells who eventually told me about a small community program in the city, run by a nonprofit that offered support groups for people exploring questions about gender and self-expression. She was careful when she mentioned it, not to make it sound like a prescription. She said, "Some of my clients have found it useful. Some haven't. It might be worth knowing exists." I remember taking the pamphlet home and setting it on my coffee table, where it sat unopened for almost 2 months. I would walk past it on my way to the kitchen, and I would pretend not to see it, and then I would come back and pick it up and put it down again without reading it. And then one evening in early spring, I picked it up and read it, and I called the number, and I signed up for a program that met on Tuesday evenings for 8 weeks. I want to tell you about the first night of that program because it was, in a very quiet way, one of the most important nights of my life. The meeting was held in the basement of a community center, in a room with fluorescent lights and folding chairs arranged in a loose circle. There were 9 of us, plus a facilitator named Renee who had short gray hair and a warm, unhurried voice. We didn't have to say our full names. We didn't have to say anything, actually. We could just sit and listen if we wanted to. And I want you to understand, because I think this is important, that this program was not what people sometimes imagine when they hear the word program. There was no makeover. There was no dramatic transformation. There was no montage of me trying on outfits with a pop song playing in the background. It was just 9 adults sitting in folding chairs, taking turns speaking honestly about their lives. Some of the people there were exploring the possibility that they might be transgender and considering medical steps. Some were people who identified with their birth gender, but wanted to express themselves in ways that fell outside conventional expectations. Some were still figuring out which category they belonged to, if any. And some, like me, weren't even sure they were allowed to be in the room in the first place. What united us was not a shared answer, but a shared question. Who am I when no one is looking? And what would it cost me to find out? And what might it cost me not to? Over those 8 Tuesdays, I began to change, though not in the ways I had feared or hoped. I did not walk out of that basement a different person. I walked out as the same person, with the same face and the same job and the same anxieties, but with something I hadn't had before, which was permission. Permission to sit with the question. Permission to not know the answer. Permission to try things on, both literally and figuratively, without treating every experiment as a verdict on my entire soul. I began, cautiously, to explore forms of self-expression that I had denied myself for decades. I bought a few pieces of clothing that felt right to me, and instead of throwing them away the next morning, I kept them in a small drawer in my apartment and looked at them sometimes without wearing them, just to remind myself that they existed and that I had chosen them. I tried different names in my head, silently, when I was walking to work, and I noticed which ones made me feel like myself, and which ones felt like costumes. I let myself imagine, for the first time in my adult life, a version of my future that I had not been given permission to imagine as a child. I want to be honest about something here, because I think this part of the story often gets skipped over, and it's the part that matters most, in my opinion. Self-discovery is not a montage. It is not a triumphant reveal. It is not a moment of finally being seen by the world. Self-discovery is slow and often confusing and full of small, undramatic days where you do a load of laundry and go to work and wonder whether anything is actually changing. And it also requires something that people don't talk about enough, which is responsibility. Responsibility to yourself. To be honest even when honesty is inconvenient. Responsibility to the people in your life. To let them adjust to your truth at their own pace, and not to demand from them a version of understanding that they may not yet have the tools for. Responsibility to the community you are joining, to represent it not as a spectacle, but as a set of ordinary human beings living ordinary human lives. And responsibility to the version of yourself that came before, the one who is scared and secretive and lonely, to treat that person with compassion instead of contempt, because that person was doing the best they could with what they had. I told my sister Marian first. It was 2 years after I started the program, and I flew home for her birthday, and on the last night of my visit, we were sitting on her back porch with mugs of coffee, and I said, "There's something I've been trying to figure out about myself, and I would like to tell you about it if you're willing to listen." She listened. She listened for almost 2 hours, and when I was done, she reached across the small table between us and took my hand and said, "I love you. I don't understand everything you just said, but I love you, and I want to understand. Give me time." That was more than I had dared to hope for. I had prepared myself for silence, for anger, for pity, for 100 different reactions. I had not prepared myself for love, plain and honest, offered without conditions. I cried on the flight home the next morning, and the man sitting next to me pretended not to notice, which was its own small kindness. My parents took longer. My father, especially, struggled. He is a man who was raised in a specific time and place, and the language I was using to talk about myself was not language he had ever had to think about before. He didn't yell. He didn't throw me out. He got quiet in the way he gets quiet when something is hurting him, and he told me he needed time. And I gave him time because I remembered how much time I had needed myself, and I understood that it was not fair to ask him to travel a distance in weeks that had taken me decades to travel. My mother cried, and then she asked practical questions, which is her way, and then she started sending me articles she had found on the internet, some of them helpful and some of them not, but all of them offered with a mother's clumsy, determined love. About a year after I told them, my father called me on a Sunday afternoon and said, "I've been reading. I don't have this figured out, but you're my kid, and you're a good kid, and we're going to be okay." And that was enough. That was more than enough. I'm not going to pretend the world got easy after that. It didn't. There are still days when I catch a stranger looking at me for a beat too long, and I feel the old shame try to climb back up my throat. There are still conversations at work that I have to navigate carefully, still forms with checkboxes that don't quite fit me, still moments when I have to decide whether to correct someone's assumption or let it slide for the sake of the meeting. There are friendships I have lost, some abruptly, and some in the slow, quiet way that friendships sometimes end, when the people involved simply stop reaching out. There are relatives who send Christmas cards addressed to a name I don't use anymore, and I have to decide, each year, whether that hurts enough to say something about, or whether it is one of the many small compromises that come with loving people who are trying imperfectly to keep loving you back. But I also want you to know that my life is better now. Not perfect. Not effortless. Not a fairy tale. Just better. I sleep more soundly than I used to. I laugh more easily. I have friendships that go deeper than any friendships I had in the first 30 years of my life, because I am finally showing up in those friendships as a whole person instead of a carefully edited draft. I have a partner now, someone I met at a bookstore of all places, who knew everything about me before we ever went on a date, and who loves me not despite my history, but because of the honesty that history required me to develop. I have hobbies that I actually enjoy, instead of hobbies I picked because they made me look a certain way. I have a relationship with myself that is not warm every day, but is at least honest every day, and I have learned that honesty is the ground that everything else has to be built on. I want to talk before I close about a few things that I hope might be useful to whoever is listening. I want to talk about them not as advice, because I am wary of advice, but as observations from someone who has walked a version of a road that some of you might be walking. The first is that identity exploration, whatever form it takes for you, is not a decision you make once. It is a conversation you have with yourself, over and over, for the rest of your life. You are allowed to change your mind. You are allowed to try things that don't fit, and set them aside without shame. You are allowed to arrive at an answer that surprises you, and you are also allowed to arrive at an answer that surprises no one. The point is not to reach a destination. The point is to keep walking, honestly, in the direction of yourself. The second is that the people who love you are usually more capable of loving you than you give them credit for, but they are also human, and human love sometimes moves slowly. Give them time. Give them information they can use. Answer their questions patiently, even the ones that seem obvious to you, because what is obvious to you now was once unfamiliar to you too. And if the people in your life cannot make the journey, if some of them turn out to be unable or unwilling to walk with you, grieve them the way you would grieve any loss, and then keep walking. There are other people out there, more than you can imagine, who are waiting to walk with you. The third is that self-expression is not the same as self-indulgence, and this is a distinction I think gets lost in a lot of public conversations about these topics. Exploring who you are is not a rejection of responsibility. It is, if you do it right, an embrace of responsibility. You become responsible for your own honesty, for your own emotional well-being, for the impact of your choices on the people around you, and for the example you set for anyone who might be watching you and wondering if it is safe to ask the same questions about themselves. Living authentically is not a permission slip to be careless. It is, if anything, an invitation to be more careful, more thoughtful, more grounded in the values you actually hold. The fourth is that mental health is not a side conversation to any of this. It is the center of it. If you are struggling, please talk to someone, and please understand that the person you talk to does not have to be a professional to be helpful, but a professional can help in ways that a friend cannot. Therapy changed my life, not because Dr. Wells told me who I was, but because she gave me a room in which it was safe to ask. If you cannot afford a therapist, there are community programs, sliding scale clinics, peer support groups, hotlines, online communities, and other resources that exist because people who have been through hard things want to make the road easier for the people coming behind them. You are not alone, even when it feels like you are the only person in the world carrying whatever it is you're carrying. Reach out. It is one of the bravest things a person can do, and it is also one of the most ordinary. People do it every day. You can too. The fifth, and maybe the most important, is that you are not a problem to be solved. You are a person to be known. There is a difference, and the difference matters. When I was younger, I approached my own inner life as if it were a puzzle I needed to crack, a bug in the code that needed to be found and fixed. That framing kept me stuck for years, because I was treating myself as an object of investigation rather than a subject worthy of curiosity and kindness. When I finally shifted, when I began to approach myself the way I would approach a friend who had come to me with something difficult to share, everything got easier. Not fixed. Not resolved. Just easier. I became a person I could sit with, instead of a mystery I was trying to escape. And I think that shift is available to anyone, regardless of what the specific content of their questions might be. You are allowed to be curious about yourself, without demanding that the curiosity produce a verdict. You are allowed to know yourself the way you would know a good book, slowly, chapter by chapter, without skipping to the end. I want to say a few things about the specific topic of clothing and self-expression because it is often what people focus on in stories like mine, and I think it is often misunderstood. For some people, wearing clothes traditionally associated with a different gender is part of a larger story about identity that eventually leads to significant changes in how they live, how they name themselves, and how they move through the world. For other people, it is a form of self-expression that does not require any of those larger changes. For others still, it is something they engage with privately and briefly and never think about again. All of these experiences are valid, and none of them is a template for the others. What I hope you take away from my story is not that everyone who tries on a piece of clothing outside their assigned category is embarking on the same journey I embarked on. What I hope you take away is that the meaning of any of these experiences is something the person having them gets to define for themselves over time with patience and honesty and, ideally, with support. I also want to be clear about something else, because I think it matters. My story is one story. It is not the story. The community of people who explore gender expression, in whatever form, is enormous and varied, and no single narrative can represent it. There are people whose experiences are very different from mine, whose paths are shorter or longer, whose conclusions differ from mine, whose challenges I have not faced, and whose resources I did not have. I am telling you my story, because it is the only story I am qualified to tell, but I want you to know that if my story does not sound like yours, that does not mean either of us is wrong. It just means we are two of many. Listen to as many of us as you can. Read widely. Talk to people. Remember that every human being you meet is carrying a version of themselves that you cannot fully see, and that includes people whose lives look nothing like yours or mine. I want to circle back before I close to the question of family because I know that for many people listening, family is the hardest part. I was lucky. I was lucky that my sister opened her arms. I was lucky that my father, after a long silence, chose curiosity over fear. I was lucky that my mother's love expressed itself as clumsy articles and awkward questions rather than as rejection. Not everyone gets that luck. Some of you have families who cannot or will not walk this road with you, and I do not want to minimize how devastating that is. But I want to tell you that family, in the deepest sense of the word, is not always the family you are born into. Family is the group of people who choose you and who let you choose them back. If your birth family cannot be your family right now, please know that there are other people out there who are ready to be your family, and that finding them is a slow and worthwhile work. Do not give up on that. And also, if there is any door in your birth family that is not fully closed, keep gently checking it over the years because people do change, sometimes in ways that surprise everyone, including themselves. I have been talking for a long time and I know it. I want to give you one last thought before I go, because it is the thought that has meant the most to me as I have looked back over my life. For most of my 30s, I believed that the years I spent hiding were wasted. I looked at the frightened young man in the attic mirror and the panicked 20-year-old scrubbing lipstick off his mouth, and I thought, all that time, all that suffering, all that loneliness for nothing. But I have come to see it differently now. Those years were not wasted. They were the ground I was walking on. They taught me how to listen for the quiet voice inside me, because the quiet voice was all I had. They taught me compassion for anyone who is hiding, because I know intimately what it costs. They taught me patience with other people's journeys, because my own journey took so long. They taught me that transformation is possible, at any age, at any stage, and that the door to knowing yourself is never closed for good, even if it has been closed for a very long time. If you are listening to this, and you are somewhere in the middle of your own version of this journey, I want you to hear me say this clearly. There is nothing wrong with you. There is nothing broken in you that needs to be fixed. There is only a self that wants to be known by you first, and then eventually by the people you choose to trust. Take your time. Be honest with yourself, and gentle with yourself, and patient with the people around you. Get help when you need it. Rest when you need it. Do not measure your progress against anyone else's. And remember that the goal is not to become someone new. The goal is to become, at last, familiar to yourself. To sit in your own life the way you would sit in a house you finally built with your own hands, imperfectly, painstakingly, but truly yours. Thank you for watching and spending this time with me. If this story helped you understand yourself or others a little better, feel free to explore more on the channel.